Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Zhu Jingtao. I'm a student from London School of Economics and Political Science, studying the bachelor degree of Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. I'm the student leader for the Marian Forum, a multi-year program aimed at accelerating the kind of leadership the world needs urgently. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused disastrous consequences, not only in the aspect of global health, but also in the global economy. Policymakers have been working hard to facilitate economic recovery. However, when governments and central banks spend enormous money to overcome the crisis, they can in parallel start to do long overdue reforms. Today, we are going to discuss more about the reforms. And I'm very honored to introduce our guest today, Mrs. Valeria Gontareva. Mrs. Gontareva started her career in financial services in 1993 and built up over 2 decades of private sector experience at both Ukrainian and international financial institutions. In 2014, she was appointed as a governor of the National Bank of Ukraine. She was the first woman to lead Ukraine Central Bank. During her time as a governor, she had led drastic and vital reforms in the banking sector despite all kinds of difficulties. Since 2018, Mrs. Gontareva joined LSE Institute of Global Affairs as a senior research fellow. She recently published a book titled Mission Possible: The True Story of Ukraine's Comprehensive Banking Reform and Practical Manual for Other Nations. So welcome to join me today, Valeria.
Yes, thank you very much for introduction. And I'm absolutely happy to be today with young leaders because, you know, we launched right now Marian Forum. I think it's in today's life, it's absolutely crucial to really build up infrastructure of new powerful leaders. And Marian Forum is an accelerator, it's a real platform and accelerator for ecosystem of building this reform platform. And I think that Marian Forum is like a dream for new generation, like so-called mini Davos for new leaders of our times.
Thank you. So I think we can start from your book. So I have actually read your book, and in which you said that the COVID-19 time is actually a time for reforms. So why do you think so?
I can tell you that it's not just because I observed today's situation in the globe, but it's also based on my previous experience. Because when I joined Central Bank of Ukraine, it's a National Bank of Ukraine, it was in the middle of 2014, I immediately faced real perfect storm. And real perfect storm, it was not just a real bloody wartime, because Ukraine was in war with Russia. And Russia occupied Ukrainian territories, Crimea, and after it was some real war in Donbass, in eastern part of Ukraine. But what's the financial consequences of that? We lost about 20% of our GDP. We lost 15% of our territories. Of course, we immediately lost export revenues because eastern part of Ukraine was our export-oriented area. And that's why it was absolutely incredible wartime and incredible perfect storm. Moreover, we had collected disbalances during the last 20 years in Ukraine. That's why even without a wartime, we already faced absolutely incredible problem with our balance of payments, we had absolutely no any currency reserves. Our banking system was absolutely ill and outdated, and central bank was like, you know, medieval monster. And after 3 years, we achieved really successful results. And I'm very proud that right now Central Bank of Ukraine recognized like one of the modern central bank institution in the world. That's why I'm really proud to tell you that my experience, it was not just talking, but doing all these reforms. And that's why I'm absolutely sure that right now, COVID-19 time, it's a good time for reform. And I could justify why. Because it's a real wartime. But in Ukraine, as I told you, it was a real military war. But right now it's a war with invisible enemy, with coronavirus. But in the same time, this wartime really distracted all areas of our lives. That's why we can observe not only GDP fall, we can observe also real business disruption. And we can observe absolutely increase in public debt. We can observe, of course, all visible problems in health sector. And unfortunately, compared to global crisis of 2007, 2008, we have quite a limited room for maneuver from a monetary policy perspective, because unfortunately, especially in developed countries, central banks already utilize this room for maneuver. Even before crisis, this particular crisis, that interest rate was in close to zero territory. And it was absolutely incredible expansion of balance sheet of central banks and the European Central Bank, Federal Reserve banks. And but at the same time, banking sector was better prepared for this crisis than before, because banking sector accumulated special capital buffers, which right now they very usefully utilized to fight this coronavirus crisis. But it means that we have limited room for maneuver, and in the same time, government and all authorities spent absolutely incredible amount of money to overcome this crisis. And it means that we need to use this momentum, use this momentum to really introduce and implement structural reforms. And that's why I think that COVID-19 time, it's a really good time to start drastic, comprehensive reforms.
Yeah, I think you mentioned very good point about we must use this momentum, like kind of seize the moment. So in your opinion, who do you think needs such reforms?
First of all, when we observe all countries around the globe, we could recognize that unfortunately reforms are needed everywhere. Of course, for example, for some countries, it should be drastic revamp of banking sector. And for example, right now we observe that healthcare sector require reforms even in very developed countries. For example, in United Kingdom, you can observe that statistics and recognize right now that unfortunately the death rate to 1 million people may be one of the highest in the world. It means that reforms are needed. For example, here it's NHS reform, and it's not about money, believe me. It's not about the concept of NHS, it's about efficiency. It's why the main moment for all reformers not to be afraid of word reforms. Reforms, it's how eliminate inefficiencies. And right now, when governments spend tons of money to overcome this crisis, they could really introduce action plan and strategic points and start to do all these overdue reforms. And when we are back to emerging markets, it's absolutely clear for all of us that a lot of emerging markets require banking sector reform, public finance reforms, tax system reforms. monetary policy reforms. It's a different type of reforms for emerging market, I can tell you. And what else? For example, all central banks in the world right now should adjust to new reality, because when we observe the cyber security, when we observe all this de-oligarchization, de-dollarization, de-offshoreization, you know, it's a universe. And that's why all central banks need to adjust to new reality and be agile and face fintech, not like a threat, but like a push for further development.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point you mentioned about we need reforms, and reforms bring efficiency, which is what we really need now. However, we observe that there are a lot of resistance reforms. I know, like yourself have experienced these difficulties and strong resistance. And we also observe, like, in almost everywhere there are these huge resistance reforms. Why?
It's always, you know, for me right now, the coronavirus, you remember the picture of coronavirus. And for me, it's right now, when we're talking about reform, this picture displays in my mind, because for me, we ask ourselves why all people around the globe so resistant to change. What type of corporate immunity system or organizational antibody attacks all these changes. That's why when we're talking about coronavirus, we are talking about antibody, about you know, herd immunity, and this in real parallel with what's going on with reforms. First of all, when you observe right now speeches of all leaders around the globe, everybody talking about reforms. You have no doubt that everybody talking, but better, you know, but we should stop to talk and start to really implement and do reforms. That's why my book called Practical Manual, How to Do Comprehensive Reforms. And it's a really practical manual, because when I provide some recommendation, even on for policy response on COVID-19, you read my book, and you know, I immediately transfer a reader to a special chapter dedicated to one particular aspect. It means that we should not talking about reform. We should start to do reform, and start to do reform. It's not like a slogans. Let's do reform. Let's do our life better. No, it's absolutely technical exercise how to reach real success from point A, real disaster, to point B, real success. What's the time horizon? What kind of resources? What kind of technical support? What kind of you know, social support you need? And after, it should be absolutely real action plan with real visible targets, with KPIs, absolutely standard approach, project management approach. I think it's a really the point. And because when you start to observe, as I told you, all CEO of big companies, they always said that they do not just support reforms, they'd like to be a leader of these reforms. And after, you know, because it's a lack of process management, it's a lack of knowledge how to do that, it's a lack of good, proper infrastructure for to amplify reforms. Sorry, I will, yes. We see a very limited result. But what I'm happy right now, that I think that real war time and COVID-19 time, it's a really a good time when the resistance to reform decrease. You know why? Because everybody in the world right now, they'd like that government and authorities will save their lives, will help them to overcome all this crisis. It means that they rely on all their action. It means that government and authorities should immediately take this advantage and start comprehensive reforms, because it's a limited resistance right now to reform.
Mm. Yes, I strongly recommend the audience to read Valeria's book. I actually read it. It's very specific about specific points and what you can do. It's like really a practical manual and a guidance. Yeah.
I'm a banker, that's why it's for banking sector. But banking sector, it's a huge one, because central banks start from monetary policy, exchange rate policy, capital control policy. And after, of course, it's a banking sector, like a banking sector supervision. And it's a story how to clean up banking sector. And after, of course, it's a special chapters dedicated how to transform central bank, institutionally transform central bank. It's a very, very important. It should be not one-man show. It should be institutional transformation.
My next question will be more specific to this pandemic crisis. So I want to ask, why can't emerging markets copy the actions of a developed economy governments in this fight against this crisis?
I could tell you that, of course, developed market right now, of course, more flexible, because unprecedented crises require unprecedented measures, no doubt. And we observe right now absolutely incredible injection of liquidity through different type of instruments. For example, US Treasury announced $3 trillion program for US. European Union announced 1.4 billion program for European Union. It's absolutely incredible amount, and you know why. Unfortunately, as we already discussed, only central banks could not solve the problem, because it's not just liquidity. You need to support real business, you need to support real employment, you need to support different social programs. That's why it's absolutely incredible amount of money. And but in the same time, how they do all of that? I mean, of course, treasuries and governments, what they're doing, frankly speaking, just emission of money through different type of instruments. For example, in US, it's through the program of purchase of assets. In European Union, it's also special purchase program, and also some special COVID-19 funds. And in the same time, you know, it's very dangerous way for emerging markets to do that. Because in my book, there is a special good chapter. I very recommend all central bankers in emerging markets and students, future leaders, to read this chapter. This chapter called Stop Fiscal Dominance. What does it mean? It means stop to print money just to cover all these needs, because it will be non-productive, and inflation will be really high later on. And inflation, of course, will be linked with devaluation of your local currency. And of course, it's like a vicious circles, absolutely not a healthy environment. If you that's why, you know, the difference between developed markets, they can allow themselves to print this money without punishment. And but unfortunately, emerging market couldn't. Because it's very good example, in the beginning of this crisis, US Treasuries, 10 years US Treasuries, yield of these US Treasuries was less than 1%. And nevertheless, it's absolutely incredible, huge demand from around the globe to buy US Treasuries, because everybody, all investors consider US Treasuries like is, you know, heaven, safe haven. In the same time, absolutely opposite picture in emerging markets. During first 3 weeks of the crisis, $100 billion were withdrawn from emerging markets. And it was immediately negative effect on the yield curve of Eurobond and local bonds of emerging markets. That's why it's a very good picture for you to understand why you should use different approach. Of course, all this money supply from developed markets help emerging markets as well. You can observe right now, after 3 months of this panic, right now situation was stabilized. Why? Because investor feel comfortable. Investor again agree to invest to emerging markets, yield curve already stabilized, and all of that. But believe me, it's a main difference between developed market and emerging. You could not use the same technique. I do not want to bother our guests with technical aspects. You can read it in my book. It's a chapter 13, a special policy response for emerging markets. But the main idea, of course, is that when we have a real war, like a war in Ukraine, no international community could support your military expenses. But right now, it's a different story, because COVID-19 special tools to support all emerging markets introduce all international financial institutions. For example, $1 trillion was announced by IMF, World Bank, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. All of them announced special program to support emerging markets for COVID-19. And also, we can observe right now that a lot of countries start to utilize their quantitative easing. Means they start to do some actions like developed countries. And my recommendation to all these countries, even if you start to do that because of its absolutely incredible situation and incredible crisis, use this time to implement all needed reforms. And my book was not just Central Bank of Ukraine didn't print money and do all this money emission to support. No, we did. But because of military expenses was not a virus, it was a real war in our territory. Because absolutely it was incredible accumulated disbalances. It was absolutely incredible perfect storm, but in the same time we use this time to implement our reform. We switched to flexible exchange rate. Ukraine was linked 100% back to US dollar more than 25 years of our independence. It created absolutely incredible disbalances. Our current account deficit was more than 10%. It was not sustainable at all. We switched to flexible exchange rate. We switched to new monetary policy of inflation targeting. We clean up Ukrainian banking system, and we build absolutely modern financial institution, the central bank, modern central bank like institution. It's a main achievements, and it means that even if you use right now, because of crisis, all your local QE, and you could, of course, do your needed reform, and next time it will be no longer needed, because all this quantitative easing, it's after all in emerging markets, it will be definitely unproductive money emissions, and it means that 99% it will cost you very high inflation and devaluation of your local currency. And right now, of course, because all international financial institutions, especially IMF, really focus to support all countries. Right now, more than 100 countries already ask IMF support from emerging markets countries, I mean. And that's why, first of all, you need to use these funds. You need to use these funds to support your budget deficit. Because unfortunately, when your GDP is falling, in the same time your expenditure is growing, it's the opposite direction, and you have quite sizable gap in your budget. But right now, IMF is really supportive. They always support the budget deficit, but in the same time, use this time and this support from international organization, especially like buy time for your reforms. They will provide you money. This money will buy time for your reforms, because reforms could not be done in one day. It's a process.
Yes, it's like we see like many countries at this time, they are very desperate and panic. So they start to do a lot of policies without really like kind of thinking about the consequences. And you raise a point about they should be cautious about fiscal policies, cautious about QE. They should use this time to do reforms as well, and they should get support from global institutions, like financial institutions like World Bank. So I think another question I want to ask is, so what's this ultimate goal that the government and central banks should aim for in response to this pandemic crisis? Because to me, like it seems many countries, they try to aim for economic recovery in terms of, okay, we have this pre-crisis, we have this GDP growth rate of, for example, like 4%, and we have unemployment rate of 3%. Now, after the crisis, we want to do everything, try everything to go back to that growth rate and that unemployment rate. Do you think this is something the government should aim for?
It's our discussion with you about all anchors and new ideas for macroeconomists. And it's very interesting question. When we are doing reform, it's not just about recovery to the previous level. We are doing reform for efficiency of some processes. As we discussed with you, even if NHS reform here will be successful with the same growth rate like before, is it bad or good? We will not lose lives. We will, because idea of NHS to have equal treatment for everybody, it's absolutely good. But the main idea to have good equal treatment for everyone. If we mixed up the different, definitions, we'd like, for example, we are talking about inequality. It's a token and token. We could use absolutely right now effectively this moment to start to really fight with inequality. For example, we are not talking about just care sector, because when we observe healthcare sector in America, they already show statistics that some Afro-Americans or Latin community was hit more than other, for example, white background or something like that. We are talking about global inequality, which is rising. That's why if inequality level in our ratios, macroeconomics ratios will be real, visible, which we can really calculate and compare, we could after to set up some KPIs and start to reach these KPIs. For example, a very good example for London, because I work and live in London, and I know that real estate is absolutely not affordable for people, even with very, very low interest rate for mortgages. What does it mean? Let's put this affordable real estate for general population. Let's put not to support, it's a lot of new construction in my area. And when I observe the prices of this new construction, it's not affordable even maybe for professor of London School of Economics. And this construction are absolutely empty, no one's there. What does it mean? What we support, because central banks, we have this idea of macroprudential policy. And we could observe that unfortunately during this crisis, macroprudential policy doesn't work properly. After the crisis of 2008, it was a very good idea to create capital buffer for banks. And right now, during this crisis, banks utilize these capital buffers for $500 billion, which free new capacity for banking sector for $5 trillion. It's absolutely good. It means that macroprudential policy could work. But the macroprudential policies should be new focus for how to fight with inequality, how to create affordable real estate for general population. It should be different focus, not just how to support developers who try to sell us very expensive real estate. Means it's not just GDP. We need maybe some qualities different from just macroeconomic. And after that, when we put all of them in our program, and after we start our process of reforms.
Yeah, I think very right. It's like indicators like GDP, they are kind of a tool, it's a means to an end. We should not kind of see it as the end itself, as you mentioned. That's not the purpose of reforms.
Please do not kick out this ratio. We agree that GDP matters, but let's consider that GDP per capita means more. In the same time, when in European Union population decreasing, it means that it's automatically GDP per capita could be increased. Yes. Yeah, because it's. But I think it's not enough right now. 21st century, it's not enough just rely on all these old school anchors. We need to add new one. Not new one, but new. A lot of new, not a new one.
Okay, I have a last question for you. So, as experienced reformer, so what kind of recommendations you want to give to other reformers? I know you have already given a lot, so like maybe some brief sentences to other reformers.
First of all, chapter 12 of my book, it's exactly about recommendation for other reformers. It's not just recommendation for other reformers, it's also recommendation for international financial institution, means for IMF and for World Bank. That's why it's even more extended. But first of all, if you start to do reform in your country, first of all, consider right now situation not like a disaster, but like a real momentum to start to do comprehensive reform. It's a more mental, it's a more slogan, but nevertheless consider that, wake up in the morning and understand that it's opportunity. And after second one, of course, if you'd like to do comprehensive reform in your country, you need to start to create infrastructure of these reforms. For example, in our country, we created a reform council. It means that when you start to do reforms, it's very difficult to do reform only, for example, in one particular sector. Because if you do reforms in banking sector, you do not do reform with state monopolies, or you do not do reform with Ministry of Finance and, for example, for manage the public finance, manage public debt, your reform will not be successful. Means that it's a comprehensive program. And you can read in my book, for example, how it was done for financial sector. Because it was a restructuring of external debt by the Ministry of Finance. It was a special program how to eliminate gaps in state monopolies. It's a complex program. That's why you need a platform. You need a platform when you will discuss the concept of your reform. But after, it should be not slogans, it should be real action plan. For example, for 5 years or for 3 years, for example, we achieved all our and completed, and my mission was completed after 3 years in the central bank. We did all needed reforms. Frankly speaking, if you will meet more cooperation from other governmental body, you can achieve it maybe in 2 years' time. But it's impossible to achieve, for example, during next few months. No, it's a program for 2 or 3 years. Be prepared that it's a long process. Infrastructure of this reform, it's written in my book, that's why I will not, how to build this infrastructure. Because if you do not monitor, if you do not use project management approach, all your reforms will stay like slogans. It will never be implemented. That's why reforms, it's not, we'd like to achieve the better life. No, it's a real action, and how to get to this point in 2 or 3 years' time. It's absolutely straight document. After, of course, try to utilize international support. It's not only about money, it's about technical assistance. Because you do not need to reinvent the wheel. You do not need, because I always say in Ukraine, you do not need to reinvent a Ukrainian bicycle. You know, you need to really get best international practice, and of course implement all this best international practice. And for this, even a special chapter in my book about how to do a coordination of all these sponsors. Because you can observe tons of absolutely not a high level professional technical assistance, but be very careful, not spend your precious time to weak technical assistance project. Find a very good one with strong people who could deliver you what you really need, for example, for implementation of your reforms. The third one, do not, first of all, you need to create the proper rule of law in your country. And you should implement special legislation to support your reform. And moreover, we were more naive when we start to do our reform. You need to create safeguards mechanism that this reform could not be overturned, that could not be, you know, blow up after. It should be real, very strong mechanism of safeguards, how to, you know, stay with this reform forever and develop further. It's quite a challenging instrument, because unfortunately in a lot of emerging markets, it's tons of corruption, especially in a legal system, in a judge courts, judicial system. That's why it should be in parallel. You should do reforms there. Otherwise, they could jeopardize all your efforts. That's why proper legislation, safeguards for reformer. And of course, we could not do reforms irreversible. We couldn't, because you know, everything in this life could be reversed. But in the same time, you need to create such a legal mechanisms that they will not do irreversible easier. It should be very difficult to do. Even in Ukraine, when someone tried to reverse our reforms, all international community right now support independence of central bank, because the first legislation which I require when I was a governor of central bank, it's a special law about independence of central bank. And right now, it's a real safeguard mechanism for Ukrainian central bank, because all international institutions support independence of the national bank. It's a main importance. They not support one particular person. They support institutional changes. And it's a safeguard for all reformers, for their, and a lot of different recommendations you will find in my book.
Thank you, Valeria, for joining me today and give a lot of very insightful opinions. I think they are not only inspiring for central bankers or governors, but they are also insightful for students like myself. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yes, thank you very much. And you are new leaders. I'm absolutely sure that you are new leaders. And when I observe, for example, in America, when two old candidates for presidency, I'd like very soon, in 20 years' time, to see all of you like one of real world leaders. And Mariam Forum is especially designed for such people like you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.